I'd like to thank the organizers of the International Housing Conference, A Home for All, for inviting me to address you briefly via video for this important event. Again, my sincere apologies that I couldn't appear in person. My schedule is very hectic at the moment. I would have liked to have been there. This conference is very relevant, obviously, to my mandate. I am Leilani Farha. I am the Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. I was recently appointed by the Human Rights Council in June of this year, and so I'm very new to the mandate and very excited to take up my responsibilities. For those of you who don't know, as Special Rapporteur, I am an independent expert. I do not represent government, I do not represent the United Nations, I do not represent civil society, and I don't represent any state or government. I have been appointed based on my expertise in the area of the right to adequate housing. And it is expected that my approach be global. I am, of course, one of many thematic mandate holders within the UN human rights system. Let me explain what a special rapporteur does and what I will be responsible for over the next few years. I really will be monitoring housing rights globally, which is no small task. I will do this in a variety of ways. I have the opportunity to do country missions where I investigate the housing conditions in particular states. I have the opportunity to take up communications, to answer and to ask questions about potential violations of the right to adequate housing in different contexts. I also have the responsibility to develop and further what we understand about the right to adequate housing, and I'll do that through thematic reports. And I also have a sort of broader mandate, which is a sort of education component to try to have the world, governments, civil society, academics, journalists, etc., to have all of those groups better understand that housing is a human right and what that means. And I'm going to turn to that right now so that you have a sense of where the right to adequate housing is situated, where it comes from, and what it means. So the right to adequate housing is a freestanding right, and it is found in many treaties, international human rights treaties, like the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention on Persons with Disabilities, the convention that deals with discrimination against women, the Children's Convention, and I could go on. It is a well-founded right, human right within the international human rights system. And its sort of chief articulation, or the most sort of, the chief articulation is found in Article 11.1 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which says that everyone has the right to an adequate standard of living, including adequate housing and food and clothing. And there have been several articulations within the international system of what the right to adequate housing actually means. It's very clear in the international system that it means much more than just four walls and a roof. The central sort of concept about housing is that it is a place where one's dignity is protected. So there's a very real dignity interest with respect to the right to adequate housing, as you can well imagine. It's also understood that at the core of the right to adequate housing are principles of non-discrimination and equality. In other words, housing will not be enjoyed if one is experiencing inequality or discrimination with respect to housing. There are also several characteristics that define what is adequate housing, and key to that, to what constitutes adequate housing, the cornerstone is security of tenure. So you should not be fearful that you're going to be evicted or be removed from your home or lands. Also key is affordability. Housing should not be priced at such a rate that those who are the least well off cannot afford housing. And of course, there are obvious things like, housing should provide protection from inclement weather, et cetera, should be close to employment and services. One of the concepts that attaches to the right to adequate housing is the idea that those who are most affected by housing policies and programs should be consulted and should be able to meaningfully participate in the development and policies and programs that would affect their housing. And there's also the principle that one should be able to claim their housing rights. So if you feel that your rights have been violated, you think that they've been violated, you should have some place to go where you could actually make that claim and be restored, have your rights restored to you. Let me just mention a few things about the mandate, my mandate, and how what I expect to focus on and concentrate on. A big issue that is of concern to me is homelessness. I'm concerned about homelessness in both developing and developed countries. This is a global issue. Different language is used to refer to homelessness and to understand homelessness, but it is a global phenomenon, and I'm interested to explore that and to determine how it can best be addressed. I'm interested in the criminalization of homelessness, stigmatization that attaches to homelessness. I'm also interested in developing some standards around national housing strategies, and that works in combination with a focus on homelessness. So what would an ideal national housing strategy look like if it was based in human rights law? What are the central tenets and components that might be applicable universally across the world? I also hope to focus on particular groups who I think are experiencing particular disadvantage with respect to housing. I intend to focus on persons with disabilities, and I intend to focus on migrants and migrant workers. With respect to persons with disabilities, I think we have much to learn from the disability rights communities across the world. I think that there are some very interesting legal frameworks that disability rights groups are using that could really be applied in the housing context, and I hope to be able to harness some of that work in my own work. I do intend to spend my first thematic report looking at what I also think is an interesting issue, which is the role of subnational governments in the implementation of the right to adequate housing. There's an interesting phenomenon that occurs where national level governments have international human rights obligations. It's national level governments that sign and ratify all of these international documents and treaties. And yet housing, we all know, occurs at that very local level. And it's often municipal officials or provincial or state officials who are actually responsible for implementing housing. And so what are their human rights obligations? The relationship between the national and subnational begs analysis and begs to be better understood. And I do hope in my first thematic report I'm able to really unearth some of the challenges in that municipal level governments implementing the right to adequate housing, some of the really innovative approaches that are being taken, and perhaps even offer some recommendations as to how that relationship between the national and subnational can work even better. Now, the organizers of the conference made a few suggestions of questions that I might answer, perhaps to trigger conversation and debate amongst you. And I found the questions really thoughtful, and I'll just provide some answers for you. I'll tell you what the questions were, and then I'll provide you with my answers. The first question I was asked was, the old model was such that supports we used to bring people who had support needs to services and sort of segregate them from society, sort of, oh, well, you need help, you go over there and get your help. The new model or new models are emerging where, in fact, services are being brought into communities. So the question asked of me was, What are the challenges in doing that? And I think that is a really fundamental question. I think that it's fundamental because it is absolutely not what we're used to. I think the old patterns of, push people into certain services and they'll be helped, and outside of the main, was an approach that didn't ask the service provider to really look at and understand the needs of that population. So by bringing services into communities, it requires us to do exactly what a human rights approach requires. It requires us to put the people with needs at the center of our analysis, understanding, etc. It requires us to listen in new ways. It requires us to hear what people are saying, and then to interpret that appropriately into providing adequate services and meaningful services. So in a way, it's sort of very much flipping how we traditionally do this stuff, which is, I think, inherently challenging. It's sort of like the way society itself has been built, and we are going to unbuild it. So if you think about it this way, in the built environment, the environment that we live in was built basically by able-bodied people, for able-bodied people, and people with resources. So, the solution traditionally is, so you have a building with a series of steps up the front of it, a person in a wheelchair can't go up steps, so let's build them a ramp. That's the traditional model. A model that might be proposed here is a different model, where actually as we decide to offer services, we do it from the point of view of the person, in my example, with a disability. So when you build the building, you don't build it with steps. You build it with a ramp all the way up that everyone uses. So I feel like the challenge before us is exactly that, starting from the needs of the people that we are intended to serve. And the second question I was asked was, what can I do, or what can the UN do, or what can international bodies do to facilitate the shift in paradigm? And I should say at the outset in answering this question that I don't speak on behalf of the UN, so I can't tell you what I can't tell you what the UN should do because I'm an independent expert. But I can tell you some of my own ideas. I do think that we need, certainly in my own work, I intend to do the shifting of the paradigm all the time. I think I can offer to lead, we lead by example. And so in my own work, I intend to do exactly what I said needs to be done, which is to take a human rights approach and put the most vulnerable groups, the groups I am intended to serve, the groups whose rights are most at stake, put them at the center of all of my analysis and all of my work. And I would suggest that we all need to do that. And that's not paying lip service to people who are disadvantaged. That is not a tokenism. It's to really say, okay, our starting point is this vulnerable group or this disadvantaged group. Here are their needs. We're going to listen to them. We're going to hear their recommendations for change. And we're going to incorporate that into our work. I think that will take us a long way, and I think that requires us all to develop new skills because I think many of us come from a place where we are the expert and we are telling people what we think should happen, and including vulnerable groups. And so I'm suggesting that we all need to develop new skills where we can, in fact, put back our expertise, sit back and say the people who are vulnerable often do have the expertise to solve their own problems. They don't have the machinery, the resources, and they need us to advocate on their behalf, but we need to listen very directly to them. So I will close my comments here. I wish you the best of luck with this very important meeting. And again, my apologies that I can't be there in person. Thank you very much.